The candles had been burning for 2 hours when she arrived. The footman who opened the door to her was new enough in his post that he did not know how to manage a woman who handed him nothing. No card, no letter, no formal introduction tied in ribbon, only a bundle of folded documents, and a look that said she did not intend to be stopped. He took 1 step backward. She took 2 steps forward. And by the time the butler appeared from the corridor, Miss Cecily Vane was already in the entrance hall, her dark green gown still damp at the hem from the November street, her gloves thin at the fingertips, and the deeds to Vane's Cross tucked beneath her arm. She had rehearsed nothing. She had told herself in the long carriage ride from her cousin's house in Holborn that she would be composed, that she would present the documents without elevation of voice, without accusation in her face, in the even and documented manner her father had always said separated argument from evidence. Her father had been a careful man. He had believed in the orderliness of facts. It had not saved him, in the end, from the orderly machinery of a fraud. The butler said something. She did not hear it. She was already at the dining room door. The room was everything she had imagined, and nothing she could have prepared for. 12 people at table, the crystal catching the candles along its rim, a low arrangement of hothouse roses at the center, white linen without a wrinkle, and at the far end, rising from his chair with the expression of a man who had not yet decided what he was seeing, Edmund Voss, Earl of Ashturn. She had not seen him before. She had built him from rumor, from the name on the documents that had undone her family, from the cold language of legal instruments that transferred Vane's Cross from her father's estate to his. She had expected something harder. What she found was a man whose face was still, not cold. The kind of stillness that came from discipline, from holding a great deal in, without apparent effort. She walked to the table. She set the bundle down in front of her. She cut the brown cord with a small penknife she had carried in her reticule for exactly this purpose, and she spread the 3 documents across the mahogany, one beside the other, so that every person at the table could see them. "You left me with nothing," she said. Her voice did not shake. She had not expected it to. Shaking was a luxury she had not been able to afford for 14 months. And here is the record of how it was done. The room was perfectly quiet. He looked at the documents, then he looked at her. His gray eyes did not flinch. "Tell me your name," he said. She told him. He sat back down slowly, as though he was thinking and had decided that thinking required a chair. The woman to his right, who wore gray silk and diamonds at her throat and carried herself with the certainty of someone who had never been asked to leave a room in her life, leaned toward him with the small, calibrated motion of a woman managing a social difficulty. "Edmund," she said, her voice warm and quite deliberate. "A woman with a grievance at the dinner table. I am certain. This can be managed in the morning." He did not answer her. He was reading the documents. Cecily stood where she was, her hands folded in front of her, and she waited. If you have ever watched someone discover that the ground beneath a building has quietly shifted, you understand what you are about to hear. What happened at that dinner table on a November evening in 1819 was the kind of reckoning that does not announce itself loudly. It arrived in documents. It arrived in the face of a man who was reading, very carefully, what had been done in his name. Cecily Vane had been a great many things before that evening. She had been the daughter of a country gentleman who loved his books and his fields in equal measure, a girl who had grown up walking the boundary lines of Vane's Cross as though memorizing them, which she had been, in fact, doing. She had been a young woman of moderate education and immoderate practical sense, which was the kind of sense that goes unnoticed until the moment it becomes necessary. She had been, for the last 14 months, a woman with a grievance, which is what people called it when the thing taken was not jewelry or a horse, but a house and everything in it, and the quiet life that had been built inside it over 2 generations. Her father, Mr. Arthur Vane, had died in the spring of 1818. He had been 53 years old. He had been in good health 3 weeks before the fever took him, had ridden the south boundary of Vane's Cross on a Tuesday, and had been buried in the churchyard of St. Cuthbert's on a Thursday, 18 days later. It was the speed of it that had undone her. She had had no time to prepare and less time to discover, until it was already accomplished that a man named Harwick had come to her father's bedside in the last week of his illness. She had been away. That was the thing she would carry longest. She had been in Bath with her Aunt Rosamond, who had taken a chill herself and needed company, and she had not known her father was dying until a letter reached her 4 days after it had been sent, and by then the letter had been followed by another letter from a man she had never heard of, informing her that the estate of Vane's Cross had been transferred by lawful conveyance and that she would kindly arrange her departure within the month. She had gone back. Of course, she had gone back. What she found in her father's study in the bottom drawer of his writing desk was a small packet of papers he had kept together with a piece of string. He had always kept important things together with string: his household accounts, the certificate of her mother's marriage, the original deed of Vane's Cross, dated 1791, when her grandfather had purchased the property from the Calloway family who had held it before him. The deed was there. It was not the deed that had been produced to transfer the estate. Cecily had spent 3 months learning enough about conveyancing law to understand what the difference meant. She had spent 2 more months locating the original registration in the county records, which Harwick had apparently believed no one would think to look for. She had spent the 6 months since in the company of her cousin, Mrs. Cratter, Philippa Ord, who was kind, and whose house in Holborn smelled of boiled cabbage, waiting until she had enough documented evidence to walk into a room and put it on a table. She was not interested in sympathy. She was interested in her home. The social architecture of Edmund Voss's dinner table was, to the trained eye of a woman who had nothing left to lose, a legible document in itself. Lady Dorothea Voss, his aunt, sat at his right hand. She was 60 years old, with gray hair dressed in the formal style, and a gray silk gown that had cost more than Cecily's entire wardrobe. She had the manner of a woman accustomed to managing outcomes, not cruelly but decisively, with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 40 years being right about how things ought to go. To Edmund's left sat Lady Philippa Crane, who was 29 and who wore a pale blue gown and pearl earrings, and who had the composed and graceful quality of a woman who has been told her whole life that she is the correct choice. She was, it was apparent to anyone who looked, the correct choice. She was exactly what a man of Edmund's rank should want, and she knew it, and she was willing to wait for him to arrive at the same conclusion. And at the far end of the table, in the third chair from the right, between a retired colonel and a vicar's wife, sat Mr. Reginald Harwick. Cecily had not known he would be there. She had known him only from his signature. She recognized him now from the way his face went very still when he saw the documents on the table, and from the small thing his hand did at the stem of his wine-glass, which was nothing visible enough to be called flinching, but which was something. Edmund set down the first document. He picked up the second. His face did not change in any way that Cecily could easily read, but something in him had gone very quiet, in the specific way of a man who has just seen something that requires revision of a significant belief. "These are dated," he said. "Yes," she said. "This first deed was registered in the county record in 1791. The reference number is in the upper left corner. The county registrar's office confirmed it to me in writing in April. That confirmation is the third document." He looked at the third document. "Your father never sold this property," he said. "No," she said. "He did not." The candles were very steady. The hothouse roses gave off a smell of something sweet and faintly incongruous against the dark mahogany, and the November cold pressing at the windows somewhere beneath the table. A log shifted in the fireplace, settling. Lady Dorothea set her fork down with a small, precise sound. "Edmund," she said in the voice she used for difficulties, "this is a matter for solicitors, not for the dinner table. Whatever this woman's grievance, it can be addressed through the proper channels in the morning. Let Harwick look at it. He will sort it." Cecily looked at Harwick. Harwick looked at the documents. "I would be glad to look at them," he said. His voice was entirely level. "In the morning, as Lady Dorothea suggests. These things are often less complicated than they appear at first sight. Edmund looked at Harwick. Then he looked at Cecily. "How did you come to have these?" he said. She told him. She told him about the writing desk and the packet of papers and the piece of string, and she watched his face while she did. And what she saw in it was attention. Not the polite variety. The variety that was really a kind of waiting for you to finish, but the kind that was recording each specific thing she said and locating it against what he already knew. Her pulse was not behaving. She had not anticipated that. She had anticipated hostility, or dismissal, or the smooth professional courtesy that was itself a form of dismissal. She had not anticipated a man who listened as though the information she carried was genuinely new to him and important. She did not permit herself to draw any conclusions from this. He was the man whose name was on the deed. He was the man who had lived, for the past year, in the house that had been hers. Whatever his expression was doing, the facts were the facts, and she had not come here to be warm toward anyone. The colonel beside Harwick said something low to the vicar's wife. The vicar's wife looked at the documents on the table and then looked at Cecily with the expression of a woman who has just revised an assessment and is not sure what to do with the revision. Lady Philippa, to Edmund's left, said something to the woman beside her in a voice that was not quite low enough. "A woman with a grievance and a bundle of papers," she said. One must respect the persistence, at least. Cecily heard it. She was meant to. She kept her eyes on Edmund. She had been in rooms before where the wrong thing was said about her, and the room had agreed with it. She had learned, across 14 months, to manage the specific heat of that experience without letting it reach her face. What she had not prepared for was the sensation of standing in a room where one person was reading her evidence, rather than her person where the attention directed at her was not assessment, but consideration. It was a different quality of attention entirely, and her chest registered it in a way she did not examine. Edmund asked for his estate ledgers. He sent the footman who had escorted Cecily from the hall with a short instruction, and the footman left with the speed of someone who understood that speed was being required. The table watched this in a silence that had the quality of a room that has been reorganized and has not yet decided what the new arrangement means. Edmund picked up the second document again. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. She watched him read. His hands were steady. His jaw was set in that long line she had noticed when she came in. The quality of a man who has learned to carry weight without letting it show in his shoulders. There was something in the way he sat. Not arrogance, exactly, but the body's knowledge of its own authority, which in him appeared to carry also the weight of its own responsibility. She told herself this observation was purely practical. She was aware of where he was in the room, with a precision she did not remember choosing. The space between them was perhaps 8 feet, and the distance registered in her chest as both too much and inadequate. The candles above the table were very steady. She kept her breathing at the same rate she had been keeping it all evening, which was measured and deliberate, and the opposite of how her pulse was currently behaving. The ledgers arrived. He opened them to the relevant year. She saw the moment he found it. He went very still, in a way that was different from the previous stillness which had been composed. This was the stillness of impact. "Harwick," he said, "my lord. Come here." Harwick rose from his chair with the unhurried movement of a man who has decided that his best strategy is continued unconcern. He came around the table and looked at the ledger where Edmund indicated, and then at the second document which Edmund placed beside it. Cecily could not see their faces from where she stood. She could see Lady Dorothea's, and what she saw there was the small, precise collapse of certainty, like the first crack in a wall that has been trusted for years. The ledger recorded a payment, in the amount of £470, made to a property agent named Cabet in October of 1817, with the notation, acquisition, Vane's Cross, County of K. The deed of conveyance that Harwick had produced to transfer the property to Edmund's estate was dated 1 month later. The deed that lay on the table, the one her father had locked in his writing desk with a piece of string, was dated 1791, and it had a county registration number, and the county registrar's written confirmation was beneath it. Her father had not sold Vane's cross. Someone had sold it using a document that was not the original deed. Edmund closed the ledger. He set both hands flat on the table and looked at Harwick for a long time. What had happened in those months when Edmund had been in Ireland managing his uncle's estate, and before that in those 2 terrible years when he had lost first Thomas and then his own capacity to see clearly through his grief, was a story that took another hour to emerge, in fragments, across the evening. Harwick had been his father's solicitor first, and then the kind of advisor a man inherits along with the title and the debts and the responsibility, whose judgment becomes a habit because there is so much else to manage and so little time to manage it all. Thomas had died on a Tuesday in November, 3 years before Cecily's father. He had been 21 years old. He had gone out riding in the rain and come back with a fever, and Edmund had sent for the physician, and the physician had not come in time. He had been at his brother's bedside that last night, and then Harwick had appeared in the doorway with a message. The physician had sent word. Thomas had rallied. There was no immediate danger. Edmund could rest. Edmund had gone to lie down for 2 hours. When he came back, Thomas was gone. He had lived inside the guilt of those 2 hours for 3 years. He had filled them with work, with management, with the relentless administration of everything his title required, because if he stopped moving, the guilt moved in to fill the space. Harwick had always been there, efficient, steady, managing the 10,000 details that Edmund's grief could not reach. He had trusted him with everything. He had not asked, in the way of a man who does not want to look too closely, what everything was being managed into. It was the ledger that broke it open. The ledger and the documents on the table and the face of a woman he had never met before this evening, who had spent 14 months doing what he should have been doing. Looking at the details, asking the questions, refusing to accept the clean surface of things. When Edmund finally looked up from the ledger, the table was very quiet. Harwick had stopped speaking. He had been speaking for 10 minutes, producing explanations with the smooth facility of a man who keeps a great many explanations ready. And he had stopped because Edmund was no longer listening in the way that could be mistaken for reception. "Wall?" "Sit down," Edmund said. Harwick sat down. Lady Dorothea said carefully, "Edmund, whatever Harwick's errors in management, and one can see there may have been errors, this is a matter for the morning and for proper legal examination." "Miss Vane's position is not without merit, Dorothea," he said. "Not now." She stopped. This, too, was something Cecily had not anticipated, the quiet authority with which he could close a sentence, not unkindly. Harwick had not been idle during this exchange. He said from his chair, in a voice that was very much under control, that there were questions, naturally, about the provenance of the documents in question. That a deed found in a private desk without a solicitor's verification of the chain of custody was not the same as a deed that had been properly registered and attested. That Miss Vane's account of how she came to possess these papers was, of course, her own account, and one had no wish to question the sincerity of a young woman in difficult circumstances, but sincerity was not the same as legal standing, and surely the correct course was to allow the matter to go to the proper authority in the proper manner, where these things could be examined dispassionately. He said all of this in the smooth and level register of a man who has prepared this speech, or one very like it. Cecily stood very still. She had expected this. She had told herself she expected this. Harwick had been a solicitor for 30 years, and men who have spent 30 years managing the legal architecture of other people's affairs do not collapse at the first presentation of contrary evidence. She had known he would speak. She had not quite accounted for the sensation of hearing the explanation for her own dispossession delivered as a procedural concern in the voice of the man who had arranged it, in front of a room full of people who had the relaxed certainty of those who had never needed to fight for anything with documents alone. The colonel looked at the table. The vicar's wife looked at her hands. For one long moment, Cecily thought of the 14 months, of the bedroom in Holborn that smelled of boiled cabbage, and the cheerful incomprehension of a 7-year-old who had been told she must share her room with a lady who had had some difficulty. Of the letters she had written to 3 separate solicitors before any of them would see her. Of the county registrar's office on a Tuesday in March, where she had sat on a wooden bench for 4 hours, and been told finally, by a man who was clearly surprised, that yes, the registration she had described was in the record, and yes, she could have written confirmation. She had not come this far to let a smooth voice in a black coat return her to Holborn. She lifted her chin. He stood up. He was taller than he had appeared seated, which was considerable. He came around the table past Lady Philippa, who did not look at him, and past the Colonel, who did, and he stopped on the other side of the table from Cecily, beside the documents she had spread there. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Miss Vane," he said, "I owe you an answer tonight. Not in the morning." "Yes," she said, "you do. The conveyance is fraudulent." "Yes." "And Vane's Cross was never lawfully transferred to my estate. That is what the documents show. It is what they show," he said. "Because it is what is true." Something happened in the room then. The Colonel's wife set down her glass. The vicar reached very quietly for his napkin. Lady Philippa looked at the candles. Lady Dorothea, in her grey silk, became very still, and Harwick, 2 chairs to the left of where Edmund was now standing, looked at the wall. There was a long beat of silence. Edmund picked up the first document from the table with care, as though handling something that belonged to someone else, which was precisely what it was. He turned to the room. "I shall require the presence of Mr. Fortey." "Aldous in the morning," he said. "He was my father's original solicitor before Harwick was retained. He has practiced in Gray's Inn for 30 years, and will recognize these documents as I do." He looked at Harwick. "You will remain in London until Mr. Aldous has been consulted." Harwick did not answer. "Harwick," Edmund said. His voice was not raised. It had no need to be. "Do you understand me?" "Yes," Harwick said. The word came out small. Edmund looked at Cecily. "Miss Vane's estate was not mine to keep," he said. "Not to the room. To her. 9 words. The room heard them anyway." Lady Dorothea made a small sound that was not quite a word. Lady Philippa turned her head very slightly toward the fireplace. The vicar's wife pressed her lips together in the expression of a woman vindicating a silent judgment she has held for several minutes and was too well bred to voice. Cecily took one breath. The deeds were still on the table. She looked at them, those 3 water-stained documents that had spent 14 months in a paper folder inside a leather satchel inside the bedroom she shared with her cousin's youngest daughter, who was 7 years old, and who had been very kind about the sharing. She had not thought past this moment. She had thought of it as an ending, this confrontation, and had not imagined what came after the ending, because imagining past it had seemed a form of hope she could not afford. She picked up the first document from where it lay, and aligned it with the second, and held them for a moment. Not in triumph, in something quieter than that. "Thank you," she said. "No," he said. "I am sorry." He had not expected to say it. She could see that it came out plain and unguarded. In the voice of a man who does not often let plain and unguarded things out, and it landed in the quiet of the room, without anything to soften it. She looked at him then in the way she had not permitted herself to look at him since she had walked through the door, in the way that took in the whole of him rather than the useful surface, the particular gravity of his face in the candlelight. The hands that had been reading her father's documents with more care than any other person had given them in 14 months. The evidence around his eyes of something that had been carrying its own weight for a long time. She did not say anything. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and spoke to his butler. And the evening moved from confrontation into the slower machinery of procedure. The dinner party did not survive the hour. Lady Dorothea brought it to a graceful close in the manner of a woman who has managed social difficulties for 40 years and can recognize when a difficulty has moved past managing and into a different category entirely. Lady Philippa departed with the composure of a woman making a strategic withdrawal that she would later represent to herself as a matter of taste. The Colonel and his wife left with the warm haste of people who wanted to discuss what they had witnessed before. Memory softened it. The vicar pressed his hat to his chest in the entrance hall and told Cecily in a low voice that he was very glad she had come. Harwick did not leave. Edmund had been clear about that. Cecily remained, because she did not know what else to do. She stood in the drawing room with the deeds in her hands while Edmund concluded certain instructions, and sent certain messages, and did the 10 specific things that a man of his rank can do in the space of an evening when he has decided to act. She watched him from the window that looked out onto the dark street where November rain had begun again, soft and insistent against the glass. He came into the drawing room when the last of the guests were gone. She did not turn from the window immediately. She was looking at the rain, and she was thinking of her father, and she was trying to hold the evening shape in her mind without it dissolving into the emotion she had kept at a considerable distance for the past 3 hours. "There is a fire in the library," Edmund said. "If you would sit with me a little while." She turned. The library was at the back of the house, a long room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace that had been burning since before dinner, and had reached the point of warmth that makes a cold evening feel like a deliberate kindness. There were 2 chairs set at an angle to the hearth. She took one of them, he took the other. He did not speak immediately. He was looking at the fire in the way of a man who is deciding how far back to go with the truth he has been holding and how to carry it. "Thomas," he said finally. She waited. He told her about his brother. He told her about the fever and the physician and the 2 hours he had spent lying down, because Harwick had come to the doorway and said Thomas had rallied. He told her what he had believed for 3 years, and he told her what the evening had made him consider was possible, which was that Harwick had lied to him. Then, too, in that particular doorway, for reasons he could not yet fully trace but could begin to see the shape of. A man who is relied on completely is a man in a position to act without scrutiny. A man who is given total trust is a man who can manage totals. He did not tell her this as a bid for sympathy. He told her as a statement of accounting, in the manner of a man reconciling books that should have been reconciled years ago. She listened. "I am sorry about Thomas," she said when he stopped. He looked at the fire. "He would have been 24 now," he said. He was very bad at sitting still. There was something in this, in the way he said it, in the plain specific quality of the grief, rather than its vastness, that made her understand the full weight of what 3 years of guilt had been in this man's chest, and what it meant that someone had been exploiting that guilt, using the space it had cleared out in him, for years. She looked at the deeds in her hands. "My father," she said, "kept everything with string." Edmund looked at her. Every important thing, his account books. "My mother's papers. These." She held them up slightly. "There was something in the way he tied it. I used to watch him as a child. Very careful. Always the same knot." "What kind of knot?" "A reef knot. He said a reef knot never slipped. There was a long quiet." "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Edmund said. "He was," she said. The fire settled. Rain continued against the windows at the far end of the library, barely audible through the glass. Somewhere in the house a clock moved the hour forward, a low sound that measured the evening as it eased into something neither of them had come into the night, expecting Cecily had not come here for this room. She had not come here for this fire, or for this chair, or for the man sitting in the other chair whose face in the firelight was carrying something she could not name, except that it looked, for the first time since she had entered his house, like a face that was not trying to hold everything at bay. She had come here for the deeds. But the deeds were in her hands, and the evening had not ended with them. The evening had opened past them into something she did not quite have the vocabulary for yet, which was the specific feeling of being in a room with someone who had heard the worst thing that had happened to you and had treated it with the weight it deserved rather than the management it could have received. She was aware of him in the particular way she had not permitted herself to be earlier, the breadth of him in the chair, the quality of his attention when it settled on her, which was different from the polite attention of the dinner table, which was different from the formal attention of the confrontation. It was the attention of a man who was no longer managing anything. She did not look away. He said after a time, "I will see the matter to Aldous tomorrow. The fraudulent conveyance will be set aside. Vane's Cross will be restored to your father's estate, and through it to you. There will be a formal process. It will take some weeks, and I would not have you uncertain of the outcome." "I am not uncertain," she said. "No," he said. "I do not suppose you have permitted yourself to be uncertain for some time." She found, to her considerable surprise, that she almost smiled. He saw it. She saw him see it, the brief thing that moved through his gray eyes, a quality that was not quite amusement but was something adjacent to it, something lighter than anything else she had seen in him that evening. "You walked into my dinner table," he said. "I had a prior claim on the furniture," she said. He laughed. It was brief and entirely unguarded, the laugh of a man surprised out of his habitual gravity, and it changed his face completely in the space of 3 seconds. She looked at the fire. Something had changed in the room, or she had changed in the room, or the room was the same, and it was the entire architecture of the evening that had shifted. She was not sure. She was very aware of her own heartbeat. "Miss Vane," he said. "Yes. I would like, if you will permit it, to call on you, when the matter with Aldous is settled, and before, if you will have it." She looked at him. "You left me with nothing," she said. "In the sense of the legal situation. I know. And now you propose to call on me. I do." "You have considerable confidence," she said, "for a man who was reading evidence of his own solicitor's fraud an hour ago." "Yes," he said. "I have been told that about myself." She looked at the documents in her hands, the brown cord, the water stain at the corner that had always been there, her father's careful reef knot. She turned the bundle once in her hands. She set it on the small table between the chairs. "You may call," she said. The fire was quiet. The rain at the window was quiet. The house around them was quiet in the specific way of a building that has held a great deal of commotion, and has now settled into its own walls and the remainder of the evening. Edmund did not say anything else. He did not need to. He reached forward, with a careful and unhurried movement, and retied the brown cord around the documents, using her father's knot, the reef knot that never slipped, and placed the bundle back in her hands. She held them. Outside, the November rain continued, soft and steady against the library windows of the house on Grosvenor Street, which was not her house, not yet, but which felt in this particular moment less like an enemy's territory than it had when she had come through its front door 2 hours earlier, with nothing but 3 documents and the intractable conviction that facts deserved to be looked at. In the spring, Mr. Parer. Aldous confirmed the fraudulent conveyance in 14 specific points, and the matter was brought before the proper authority, with a thoroughness that left Harwick no ground on which to stand. The deed of Vane's Cross was restored to the estate of Arthur Vane, deceased, and to his only daughter as heir. He was present at every stage of the proceeding. This was not required of him. He attended regardless. By the following autumn, Cecily had returned to Vane's Cross to set the house in order. She rode the south boundary on a Tuesday, as her father had done. The boundary looked the same. The oak at the eastern edge had grown another few inches. The field her father had let in hay for 30 years smelled of what 30 years of hay fields smell like, which is a smell that does not have a name exactly, but that she had known since she was a child, and that returned to her now without the grief she had expected, or with the grief and also with something else beneath it, which was the knowledge that she had come back. Edmund rode with her. He had asked carefully and specifically if he might, and she had said yes with the same careful specificity, and they had ridden the boundary of Vane's Cross in the October afternoon light, which was the particular light of the English countryside in October, low and golden and very clear. She showed him the oak. She showed him the hay field. She showed him the small rise near the western edge, where, on a clear day, you could see the church spire of St. Cuthbert's, where her father was buried, the grey stone of it just visible above the trees. He stood beside her and looked at it for a long time. He was a careful man, he said. Yes, she said he was. They stood in the October light. Their horses stood behind them, patient in the way of horses who understand that the people they carry sometimes need to stand still and look at something before they are ready to move again. She was aware of his arm beside hers. of the particular quality of standing next to a person whose presence had come to feel, in the months since November, like something her body organized around without her having decided this was what it would do. He turned to her. He said her name. Not Miss Vane. Her name. The one her father had given her. The one that had felt like hers alone for the whole of the year that had been taken from her. The one that now, in his voice, in the October light, on the boundary of the land that was hers again, sounded like something being returned. She looked at him. She took one step toward him, which was all the distance there was. His hand came to her face with the particular care of a man who has spent a long time being careful about everything. Except this, and what he did not say in that moment was sufficient, and more than sufficient. Because the October light was doing the work, words would have crowded, and the spire of St. Cuthbert's was just visible above the tree line. And the deeds of Vane's Cross were in the drawer of her father's writing desk where they belonged. The reef knot held. If this story has stayed with you as it has with me, I hope you will leave a word below. Stories that begin with evidence sometimes end somewhere. Neither party expected. She kept the documents. Of course she did. They lived in the bottom drawer of the writing desk, beneath her mother's papers and her father's account books, tied with the same piece of brown cord. She sometimes took them out, not from anxiety, but from the particular habit of someone who has learned to trust the primary source. Edmund came to understand in time that the reef knot was not only a feature of Arthur Vane's document storage, but also, in some sense, he could not have articulated precisely, a feature of his daughter. She held. She did not slip, even when the ground beneath had shifted. She had held, and then she had walked through the door and spread the evidence on the table and looked at him and waited for him to look back. He had looked. He would spend the rest of his life being glad he had. The library at Vane's Cross was smaller than the one on Grosvenor Street, and the fireplace smoked slightly in the east wind, which he noted one evening in December with the expression of a man composing a list of things to see to, and which she noted with the expression of a woman who had grown up with that fireplace, and knew it was perfectly fine and had always smoked in the east wind and would continue to do so. The fire burned, regardless. The rain came in off the fields, as it always had. Outside the window, the winter was settling into Vane's Cross like a long, quiet exhale, and inside, the lamp on the writing desk cast its light across the room, and the bottom drawer was closed, and the cord held. Thank you for staying until the end.